Thank you guys for being here tonight. We appreciate you. We are talking about the draft rule for the BLM's leasing and bonding nationwide. Just a quick walkthrough. We'll do some introductions for Justin and I, the basics on the BLM, some leasing and bonding updates listed in the rule, the impacts this will have on environmental and social matters, as well as some economic impacts. We'll take any questions, and then we'll give you some options if you're interested in stepping up and taking action, and then we'll part ways for the evening. So, I'm going to let Justin introduce himself real quick.
Thank you, Laura. Hey, everybody. My name is Justin Muse. I'm Director of Government Relations at the Wilderness Society. Specifically in my portfolio, I handle energy production on federal public lands. And I also handle some place-based campaigns in Alaska, specifically in the Western Arctic and in the Arctic Refuge. With respect to energy development on federal public lands, we work primarily to phase out oil and gas production on federal public lands and ensure that renewable energy, such as wind and solar, is permitted thoughtfully and responsibly on federal public lands. Um, and I'm based in Washington, D.C. So I'll kick it to you, Laura.
All right. And a big thank you for working so late tonight. Appreciate it. I'm Laura. I'm with Western Colorado Alliance. I've lived on the West Slope pretty much my entire life. I did a stint in Washington, D.C., but I came back. I didn't take my jar of dirt with me, if any of you know that reference. I'm the regional organizer for energy and climate, and I've been leading the state response on this BLM rule update. And then I also want to give a quick shout out to Rachel. She's acting as the tech whiz for me tonight. Alrighty. Going on to the basics of BLM, and it's gonna go back over to Justin again.
Yeah, thanks, Laura. So we're going to start with just a little primer on what the BLM does, what the statutes are that govern what BLM does and what it has to take into account. And then just in order to provide some context on the rule that the Bureau of Land Management issued in late July, and why it's so important to see that finalized ASAP. So why does the BLM matter? BLM manages 1/10 of the surface area of the United States, approximately 30% of minerals and soils in the United States. This translates to 245 million acres of public lands and 700 million acres of mineral estate. It also manages national conservation lands, which includes 28 national monuments and 23 national conservation areas, as well as 260 wilderness areas. So the BLM as we know it today was shaped largely by FLPMA, the acronym that you see there in the second paragraph. FLPMA stands for the Federal Land Policy and Management Act. It was enacted in 1976. And in this law, Congress directed the Bureau of Land Management to sustain the health, diversity, and productivity of public lands for the use and enjoyment of present and future generations. Per that law, BLM has two main mandates with respect to the federal lands it manages: multiple use and sustained yield. Now, when we talk about multiple use, this includes energy and mineral development of fossil fuels and renewable resources, timber production, domestic livestock grazing, outdoor recreation, rights of way, fish and wildlife conservation, and conservation of natural, historical, cultural, and other resources on public lands. And then sustained yield means managing in a manner that makes lands available for these multiple uses in perpetuity going forward. So next slide, please. So here you'll see a pretty nifty map that shows all of the lands that are managed by the Bureau of Land Management in the light brown. And in darker brown, you'll see BLM administered subsurface minerals. You may notice a discrepancy between surface and subsurface acres. This is partially explained by the fact that there are many instances where a different federal agency manages the surface acreage. That accounts for about 385 million acres of the discrepancy. An example of this is up in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. You'll see in the Alaska portion of this map, an area that's dark brown in the northeast, upper right-hand corner of Alaska. That's the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. As a wildlife refuge, the surface is managed by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And then the subsurface acreage is managed by the Bureau of Land Management. So all of those oil and gas resources that are purported to be there are managed by BLM. And then about 57 million acres are situations where private landowners own the surface and Bureau of Land Management owns the subsurface mineral estate. So that's how you get that discrepancy. Next slide, please. So this is a very helpful set of statistics that show all of the BLM field offices and the amount of acreage that they oversee, which all adds up to the 245 million acre surface acreage that I mentioned, and how much it's been tilted towards development. You'll notice in the purple on the map, the percentages, that's what percentage of the acreage that BLM manages that is available for oil and gas leasing. So the BLM has 175 field offices in 12 states. Each of these offices is responsible under the Federal Land Policy and Management Act for creating a resource management plan. RMPs are written in consultation with states, counties, localities, tribal governments, other stakeholders, and the general public. These plans determine, among other things, what percentage of the land under their purview will be available for oil and gas leasing and development. So as you can see here, BLM has historically defaulted towards development with over 90% of Western public lands open to oil and gas leasing. That's despite the fact that only 23% of these BLM administered lands have moderate to high potential for oil drilling. Also note, you'll see in the subset there some highlights around Colorado River Valley, Grand Junction, Uncompahgre, and White River resource management plans in Colorado. I would just like to highlight a recent update the Bureau of Land Management issued with respect to the Colorado River Valley and Grand Junction. These regional resource management plans are updated from time to time. And the BLM has issued a draft update to both Colorado River Valley and Grand Junction, which is particularly of interest to folks who may be on the Western Slope or calling in from the Western Slope today. These draft resource management plan updates cut land available for oil and gas leasing by orders of magnitude that I think, if finalized, will have just a big, they'll make a big difference, and we're very happy to see. So in Colorado River Valley, the draft plan would cut lands available for oil and gas leasing down from 603,100 to 143,000 acres. In Grand Junction, it'll cut down lands available to oil and gas leasing from 935,600 to 239,000 acres. So those are really big changes. And the current Bureau of Land Management is doing some good things. So just wanted to call those out. Those amendments are not yet finalized, so they won't be reflected in any maps like this until they are. But it's a step in the right direction that we should all take into account. So next slide, please. So wanted to give just a little bit more background on FLPMA. In addition to issuing land use plans, as I mentioned on the last slide, FLPMA directs BLM to manage these diverse public land resources in accordance with the BLM's multiple use and sustained yield mission, unless otherwise provided by law. Again, those uses include energy production, including fossil fuel extraction and renewable energy generation, timber production, domestic livestock grazing, outdoor recreation, rights of way, fish and wildlife conservation, and conservation of natural, historical, cultural, and other resources on public lands. These land use plans are meant to achieve a balance of uses over 10 to 20-year periods. And as Colorado River Valley and Grand Junction are being updated now, these land use plans are sometimes amended and updated in coordination with those state, county, local, and tribal stakeholders. These resource management plans, in addition to determining where the oil and gas industry can lease, are also used to recommend areas for permanent protection via addition to the National Wilderness Preservation System. They can recommend those areas, but ultimately Congress needs to pass a law to designate a specific area as a wilderness area. But that's just another thing that an RMP or resource management plan does. So now that we've spoken a bit about FLPMA, resource management plans, and the planning process in general, let's talk about oil and gas and the law that sets forth the parameters for that, the Mineral Leasing Act. So next slide, please. So the Mineral Leasing Act is the primary statute that guides the oil and gas leasing process. It was first enacted in 1920, well before FLPMA, about 56 years before FLPMA, though certain elements of it have been updated throughout the years. The most recent amendment to it was actually the Inflation Reduction Act, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. Under the Mineral Leasing Act, the Bureau of Land Management is authorized, though not required, to hold quarterly lease sales in every state where lands are eligible and available for leasing. Before any lease sale is scheduled for, or acreage for lease is specified, lands must be nominated to be leased. It's on the industry to do this. They have their pick of the lands specified in the RMPs that are available for oil and gas leasing that they then must nominate. Before the IRA, an important point, any member of the public was able to nominate lands for lease for free and anonymously, but we'll get back to that later. Next, BLM decides which of the nominated lands to offer for lease. Historically, the vast majority of nominated lands have been offered, and the agency has done little to winnow nominated acreage versus what they actually offer for lease. But they do have that authority to winnow it down. Lastly, lease sales take place. BLM administers, but each lease sale is state-specific. Parcels for lease will go to the highest bidder. The Mineral Leasing Act sets lease terms, which are 10 years, but that's often extended, as it often takes longer than 10 years to get the full value out of a specific well on a leasehold. The Mineral Leasing Act also helps ensure American taxpayers get a return on their investment for the fossil fuel industry's use of public lands for extraction purposes. These are all split between the federal government and the state in which the lease is held. Some examples of these fees and other mechanisms are minimum per acre bids. So when a fossil fuel operator bids on a specific parcel of land, they have to pay a minimum per acre bid to buy that lease. It can go up in the auction process, but there is a set minimum. Next, there are rental rates. So once the industry purchases a lease and they've set the 10-year term, they've signed the contract to hold the lease, they have to pay a fee per year between when the lease begins and when production begins. That ensures that the oil and gas, or that taxpayers are getting at least something during that period between the lease and production actually commencing. Lastly, there's a percentage royalty rate once production begins. That had been 12.5%, and the intent of that is to ensure that taxpayers in states actually get some return on investment for the massive production that takes place on these leases. The Mineral Leasing Act also authorized regulations that required fossil fuel operators to, before extraction begins, purchase bonds to ensure the complete and timely reclamation of the lease tract. Subsequent regulations issued after enactment of the MLA set minimum bond amounts. Prior to enactment of the Inflation Reduction Act last year, all of these fees were way out of date and devalued by decades of inflation. The royalty rate, although it is a percentage, was also woefully misaligned with state royalty rates. In Colorado, for instance, it's 20%. So there's a perverse incentive for companies to bid on federal lands with the 12.5% royalty rate. And it's the same in other states. Wyoming was 16.67%, Texas 20 to 25%, the list goes on. And lastly, bond amounts haven't been updated since the 1950s and 60s, so they don't come anywhere near the amount necessary to actually reclaim a well at the end of its extractive life. So that's a bit about the MLA. Now on to what the Inflation Reduction Act did. So next slide, please. So the Inflation Reduction Act included about $370 billion in climate investments over 10 years. It was signed on August 16, 2022, just over a year ago. And it included some really overdue legislative reforms to the tune of what I just spoke about. Specifically, it updated minimum bids, rents, and increased the royalty rate. To be very specific, it brought the per acre minimum bid from $2 to $10, increased rents, and implemented a sliding scale so that rents actually get steeper the longer an operator sits idle on a parcel. And it raised the royalty rate from 12.5% to 16.67%, bringing that rate in line with Wyoming, which is the state with the lowest state rate for drilling on state lands. It also implemented a new fee on nominating parcels of land. So now, instead of it being free and anonymous, oil and gas operators have to pay a $5 fee per acre to nominate lands for a lease sale. Lastly, it required operators to pay a royalty on methane byproducts from drilling. So operators now have to pay for the methane they vent and flare into the atmosphere. There were some compromises in the Inflation Reduction Act. It wasn't all good. Specifically, it tethers renewable energy permitting on federal land to the size and frequency of oil and gas lease sales. So BLM must have held a lease sale in the last 120 days prior to issuance of a right-of-way for wind or solar. It also requires the Bureau of Land Management to offer for lease no less than half of what industry nominates. And the Inflation Reduction Act, to put it simply, failed to address bonding. Financial assurances remain woefully inadequate to cover the cost of reclaiming oil and gas wells at the current juncture. So these are all complex provisions that require careful implementation, and it's BLM's job to get it right. Laura is going to speak more to that when she goes over BLM's recently proposed oil and gas leasing rule. Next slide, please. So this is the last slide that I'll cover, just to bring it all home in Colorado. Of the 2.25 million acres BLM manages here, 91% at the moment are open to oil and gas leasing. They must be available for industry to nominate unless there's another conflicting use, like renewable energy, timber, grazing, recreation, habitat protection, conservation. All that's to say, the status quo has long favored industry over residents and has put profits over people. So with that, I'll turn it over to Laura to cover the next segment of this presentation.
Thanks, Justin. I really appreciate it, and fantastic work. So now we're going to talk about the actual rule updates. Now that we have a foundation of what's going on behind the scenes and what has led up to this point, we're going to talk about some of the important changes that have taken place in this draft and what we need to advocate for to be implemented swiftly and get signed in so that we can start practicing. So, starting off with leasing, because this rule has updated leasing terms and bonding terms in order to meet the statutes put forth by the Inflation Reduction Act and some other common sense reforms. So, leasing, there is an end to non-competitive leasing. And so, effectively, this means that the industry can't just buy each other out and trade within themselves to maximize the profit off of the leases. They have to go through a competitive process, and it removes the, basement prices that they've been operating under for the last 5 decades. It does raise minimum leasing costs to a more equitable value. This is reflected with that royalty change that Justin was talking about, but it also just blanket increases all of the leasing amounts to a certain threshold. Another excellent change that we found is only responsible lessees are able to continue business with the BLM. So that's, for example, if somebody has a lease and fails to follow through on the terms of the lease, perhaps they don't clean up after themselves or they fail to pay proper royalty terms, then they're no longer eligible to lease through the federal BLM. And there's chances for them to recuperate and make up for what they did. But it's really important because that hasn't been barred before. And so if somebody was a bad actor and they outbid everybody else, chances are that the bid was going to go to them. And then what's really nice is they've also included extra lines to avoid multiple use conflicts. And so this is, again, where the land is used for multiple things. All right, maybe within such amount of distance, maybe like a mile or so, the land use transitions from extraction to another type of service like recreation. There are added barriers to protect human health, wildlife, and the other resources that the land holds, not just oil and gas. And then with bonding, all right, so this raises the minimum bonding costs. Bonding costs haven't been updated since the 1950s and 60s, and I don't know about you guys, but I've noticed that the economy has certainly changed in the last couple of years. So with that massive of a gap, we were missing out on a lot of money that's necessary to show, okay, we can clean up the land that we're using, and we are acting responsibly with the public resources that we have access to. So, by raising minimum bonding costs, this increases the chances that operators will clean up after themselves, and it's going to reduce the burden on taxpayers. This comes to the tune of, like, previous bonds covered around, the market cost right now is about 10% of the cost for reclamation, and so the rest of that money comes from the taxpayers. Now that we're catching up with this and the full bonding cost, or close to the full bonding cost, covers reclamation, that alleviates any burden on the taxpayers. And then this also eliminates what we call blanket bonds. If somebody wanted to buy a bond and have it cover multiple sites across multiple states, regardless of the state's actual rates, because it was federal land, they would apply a federal bond. And this would cover all of it. And that has been ended, and it's now marketable prices for what they actually lease and where they're extracting. So one thing I do want to talk about is this has been a great step forward, but there are some points that could be strengthened. If you talk to many people in the community who appreciate the leasing and bonding rules, they do acknowledge that there should be a framework for regular updates to these dollar amounts. That is not put in place by the current draft. There is not a limit to speculative leasing, and that is to the point of where speculative leasing is basically going into an area and saying, I bet you there's oil here, buying up the lease parcel, and then reselling it afterwards, saying, no, it's not worth my time, but I bet you there's still oil here, and so they'll flip that lease for a profit to another operator. And it also does not take into account that there are some areas that are very rich in oil and gas, and there are some areas that are very poor in oil and gas, and sometimes it takes testing to figure that out. So speculative leasing is just super unhealthy, and it takes advantage of the system. There is not a provision to address idle wells in a timely manner. There is an abandoned well clause for 2 years. However, I believe that Justin actually spoke about this briefly with this sliding scale, but it does have quite a bit of lag time. So if somebody starts to drill on this set of land and then just leaves the equipment there and says, I'll drill there later, or I'll start extraction later, that well sits there and it's prone to damage and leaking, and it causes a lot of environmental harm. And so addressing idle wells and making sure that we have security around those is important for the environmental health. And then lastly, people are calling for better transparency from the Bureau and public access to various parts of this process. So while the nominators may not be anonymous anymore, we don't have access to public lists of who's been a good or bad actor in their leasing history, which when it comes to public lands and public resources, that belongs to us. And so it seems reasonable, in most people's opinion, that we have access to the people who are utilizing our things and giving us information. So let's talk about the environmental and social implications for a couple moments. If we can reduce our carbon emissions, we're going to start saving the planet. That's quite a blunt way of saying it, but it's true. All right. So all of these measures in the leasing and bonding reform result in a better environmental situation. All right. So it decreases greenhouse gas emissions, and it will improve environmental and human health concerns. This will lead to reduced emissions, so we will have better air quality, reducing health risks, and improving our ecosystem's healths. This is also going to open up more land for outdoor access and recreation, which has been scientifically linked to improved well-being. And if we talk about environmental justice for just a couple moments, I wanted to highlight the importance of this reform being implemented on the west slope of Colorado. So Colorado has an ozone problem, that's noted, and out west we have a privilege that our geography actually limits how much ozone sequesters around our communities, and so we aren't listed as ozone non-attainment, but that does not mean that we are not at risk. What's problematic out here is at least compared to the mountain towns and the Front Range, we have a lower standard income, and because of the rural nature, we are farther away from healthcare, and so healthcare is less accessible. There is a higher proportion of Latino and Hispanic people here, which also correlates with poorer health. And most of our populations are closer to oil and gas extraction. And so these dense operations disproportionately impact our communities. And we have to care and we have to say something in order to make these changes for our people. And now let's talk about some of the money, because I know that that's a contentious point. Many industry people are like, oh, this is going to raise the cost of oil. But let me tell you what it's going to save us. In Colorado alone, in the last 10 years, we've lost out on $811 million in undercut royalty rates. That's the difference between the federal and the state bonding, the federal and the state royalty rates. We've lost out on $371 million in reclamation costs from the inadequate bonds. From low rental rates, we've lost out on $24.7 million. And throughout the extraction processes, transporting, and other refinements, we've lost out on $13 million of products because operators just wasted gas, because they don't have that oversight and there's nothing stopping them. And from that wasted gas, it's not reported and it doesn't become a sense of royalties, and so that comes in as an additional $2.4 million of lost revenue from those royalties, in addition to all of the product that we could have had in the market. When we add this up, Coloradans lost $838 million in 10 years. I'm not particularly pleased about that as a taxpayer myself, and it just tells me how much I care about this and why I want to make a difference. A lot of pro-oil and gas people argue that the cost and the economic hardship of the job transitions can be difficult and will impact our communities. And as somebody who lives out here and has depended on oil and gas in the energy industry from my way of life before, I can't argue, but I will straighten up the facts. The BLM did an economic analysis, and so it's important to recognize that by limiting some of the additional leases, we could diversify our economy, making it more resilient and self-reliant. When we think about a stock market, we don't want to put all of our eggs in one basket, and the same thing is true about economic diversification and branching into other types of energy capture. 2% of jobs on the western slope are held by oil and gas. And with these provisions, as long as we carefully plan and take care of our neighbors, those jobs can transition to mitigation or renewable energy sources. These jobs aren't going to be lost and they aren't going to go directly into the unemployment rate. That just means that they have opportunities to break away from a more volatile boom-bust economic cycle and get into something more stable for their families. Additionally, we find that properties linked to oil and gas are decreasing and decreasing in value, while residential property values are significantly rising. This leads to a better tax revenue in the modern market. And then economic analysis from BLM does say that tourism and recreation on the same BLM lands that would no longer be leased would replace that oil and gas money, We also have a massive system, employment system for healthcare, technology, and education out here, and that will help absorb some of the job transitions as well. If you want to know more about the specific numbers, Colorado Mesa University released other economic reports, which I also summarized in here as well. And now it's time for questions and answers. And just so you guys know, because of the webinar format, if you do have a question, please enter it either into the chat box or the Q&A box. I'm honestly hoping that there's no questions, which actually means that we did such a fantastic job explaining. That's a joke. I also recognize that this is a lot of information to absorb and think about. So if you find that you don't have a question right now, you're more than welcome to reach out to me. I'll have my email at the end of this, and we can discuss things again later. Riley, you've typed for responsible leasing. Do you mind expanding on that? Okay, thanks. The question reads, has it been determined what kind of checks and balances system there is in determining what qualifies a responsible leasee? That does make sense. I don't know all of the details, but effectively there are a certain set of standards that the leasees must perform to, and that does include cleaning up after themselves, paying the amounts that are due. Pretty simple business terms, but if Justin or Rachel have anything extra to add, I welcome that.
Yeah, thanks for the question, Riley. Hold on one second while I pull up more information to hopefully get you an answer on that one.
Hi, all. I can also jump in here quickly. So I know that non-compliance would indicate that you are not a responsible leasee. So when an operator falls out of compliance with the ruling as it is updated, the updated rule would then qualify what would be in compliance and out of compliance. And if you are an out of compliance operator, then not only the operator's business, but the individual name of the person holding the lease would also be held responsible, if that makes sense.
I think that covers it. Thanks, Rachel. Thanks, Laura.
I've got a power team in my corner, and I'm so grateful for you both. Thank you. All right. If you've got any more questions, feel free to shoot them out. We are still happy to continue answering them, but we will shift on for a few moments. So, let's talk about some of the things that we can do as everyday people. What can you do to make a difference? You can submit a comment letter to the Bureau of Land Management. Again, as these are all public lands and public resources, you have a say in what goes into this. You own part of this. So, you can craft your own letter or edit a pre-written letter. Pardon me. These will go into the BLM and help them inform some of the decisions they'll make on the final draft. The deadline is about 10 days away on September 22nd at midnight. If you have any questions about this, feel free to let me know. I will send out the links for this here shortly. I added them to the slideshow, not thinking about the fact that you guys can't click on my slides. So, my apologies there. But I'll send out those links here shortly. And if you do want any help crafting your own letter, you're more than welcome to reach out to me. I'm happy to help you with it. And then we can also share this information with our friends. Alright, so you can craft a local op-ed and write that into your paper, or a letter to the editor, which is a shorter version of this, and then tell people about it. I know that it's not the most exciting conversation to be like, Mom, have you heard about BLM? Leasing and bonding updates. It's super important. But honestly, when we're talking about the financial impacts on a day-to-day basis for you and I, it does end up becoming a bit more important. And then, lastly, I wanted to thank you all for coming and for joining us tonight. My email is at the bottom of the screen. It's laura@westerncoloradoalliance.org. I'm more than happy to connect you with any specific information or help you craft any messages that you might be working on and unsure of. And then Rachel has been posting links in the chat, but these will also be available to you tomorrow. I'm going to post the recording online, and that will also have all of the links with it so that you can access things appropriately.